Hello and welcome to Setting the Stage, Episode 30, Bryon and Vaesen. In order for the podcast to continue, I really need more guests to volunteer to be on the show. So if you're interested, or if you know someone who is interested, please go to gocorral.com/STS to learn more about how to apply to be on the show. That's GOCORRAL.com/STS. Hello, I'm Isaac, and you're Bryon?
Yeah, how's it going?
Good, how are you doing?
Doing quite well. Is my audio coming through okay?
Yeah, it's actually really good, which
Fantastic.
you're a podcaster, so that's not as surprising, but yeah, it's very good.
Perfect.
Right, today I'm talking with Bryon. He's here to tell us about his campaign. So before we get into the campaign stuff, tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are outside of the game.
Oh, gosh. So my name is Bryon Kershaw. I am a technical support engineer by day and also do a lot in the way of training. I was this close to being a high school English teacher and instead decided to go into the world of tech.
Okay, I mean, still languages.
Yep. And have been doing role-playing games for what feels like basically forever.
Yeah, I saw in your survey that you've been playing about as long as I've been alive. I was born in 91 too.
So yeah, I think I'm about exactly one lifetime.
Yep. Well, yeah, that's great. How'd you get started on playing?
So it's actually kind of a funny story. I was poking around inside of my parents' basement, and I was about like 8 or 10 or so, and found a giant like steamer trunk. And was like, what is this? This is like I found treasure.
Right.
So I get this thing open in this basement that I have to kind of almost crawl through, clearly setting up dungeon crawling from a very early age.
Yeah.
And stumbled across the old D&D blue box set. And as soon as I started going through it, I had never seen anything like it, and immediately needed to convince my friends they needed to check this thing out.
All right, so your parents had played then?
They had picked it up back in the 70s, had basically played it like twice and said, this is a lot of math, it's not for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just threw it in the basement for you to eventually discover.
And begin a lifelong quest with.
Yes. You were saying that you played it with your friends?
Mm-hmm.
And were you the DM for that first experience?
Always.
Or... All right.
Always.
Yeah.
Especially back in the older editions of D&D, it was a bit of a hard sell.
Yeah.
So being willing to say like, oh, I'll read the rule book, I'll figure out how it all works, I'll figure out what THACO means,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
went a long way towards getting people to be like, yeah, I'll just roll some dice and play this silly game.
Yeah, I definitely think the change to third edition made a lot of things simpler by removing THACO and removing percentile dice being used.
Oh, yeah.
As much. I mean, they're barely used at all in the third edition rules.
I miss them, actually.
There are times where it's nice, like the ability score aspect for it. I still like that a lot. And I wish that was brought back, but I understand the simplification. Like it was cool, but did it really make that much of a difference? Not really. You've had a ton of experience, like way more experience with like official campaign settings. Did you want to talk about your experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had started off doing a lot of homebrew kind of things, making up my own stories, making up my own worlds. But I very early on picked up a copy of Dungeon Magazine, and began running adventures out of that, and found what I really love to do is take a kind of pre-built setting or a pre-built world and start tinkering with it. Making changes, kind of playing around with the the layout of it all, and really just kind of making it my own.
Well, it's hard to like run a setting like faithfully, right? There's just so much information that like you just can't know off the top of your head. So of course everyone's version is like a little bit their own, but it sounds like you took it a step further than other people.
it really kicked off for me again in the old days with a big box set called The Night Below. It was an
Okay.
old second edition kind of adventure path before they really had that term.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this gigantic Underdark campaign. And I tried to run it with my friends, and we got about a third of the way through and it petered out. And I tried again with a later group, and we got like a couple of sessions in and it petered out. But something about this just really stuck with me. So I had a third group that I tried to take through it. And it took us like, no joke, about 3.5, maybe 4 years.
Wow, that's big.
Oof. We went through start to finish these big giant books. And as we're playing it, I kept changing things and kept tweaking it, kept adjusting it. And so, like, working in characters' backstories or having things they did in the first book show up in the third book. The kind of things that you would expect to happen in a story, but
Right.
which the authors just hadn't necessarily worked in. And so that really got me hooked on starting to kind of take these classic campaigns and really start to kind of break them up into pieces and really fine tune and tinker with them. So I've run through the Savage Tides back in 3rd edition through Dungeon Magazine.
That's a popular one.
I actually did an adaptation of a chunk of that for 5th edition. I've played through some of Out of the Abyss. I've played through an entire campaign of a modified version of Legacy of the Crystal Shard, which was a D&D Next adventure. So back when they were transitioning from 4th to 5th edition, D&D kept putting out modules, but they didn't actually have a system at the time. So it was this really loose, like, here's some ideas for the story, and here's general ballparks for how things might work, but we don't quite have 5th edition nailed down.
That's the Icewind Dale, like in the Drizzt novels, right?
Yep.
Okay.
So that one was like half homebrew, half stuff pulled from kind of this mostly put together storyline and kind of adding and tacking on all of these different parts to it. Played through some of Tomb of Annihilation. And I've got even more campaigns on the shelf that I want to get to at some point.
Yeah. I was thinking while you were talking about all that adventure paths have really expanded a lot. Like I've been reading through Jade Region, which is like a 15-year-old one now, I think. And that one has a bunch of notes like, oh, if this character survives, here's what they do in the next adventure. Because normally you assume the PCs are gonna like kill all of the bad guys, but what if they don't? And so it's got notes for that, which is like surprising. That's good.
Gives you that kind of jumping off point with it to sort of make it your own.
Yeah, so you can work it. I mean, they don't have the whole like, here's exactly what happens in the encounter and here's the map kind of stuff, but it's enough for you to work with.
And I've also done a bunch of non-D&D campaigns as well. So I've run Complete Masks of Nyarlathotep for Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, I want to do that one.
Oh, it's good, but I struggle with getting the party to get past the first chapter. I have run the first chapter of that like 5 times.
Wow.
And we've made it to the second chapter, I think, once before the group kind of imploded.
I mean, Cthulhu isn't for everyone.
Yeah, and generally characters tend to be a little bit more expendable.
Yeah.
Right now I'm also running a campaign for a couple of friends of Dragonbane from Free League, and also running a completely homebrew campaign of Vaesen.
What's Dragonbane? I don't think I've heard of that one.
Oh, Dragonbane is fun.
Oh, I have heard of that one. Never mind. Okay, I remember.
Yep, the Swedish version of Dungeons and Dragons, basically.
That's right. Yes, exactly. And Vaesen in your survey was also Scandinavian, as you said, and the background for it seemed very similar to the Troll book, the little kids book that I had. I don't know if you know that one.
It's vaguely familiar.
Yeah, it was like a collection of stories about like Scandinavian versions of like folk tales about trolls, and all of folk
Hmm.
tales are pretty much the same. Like they're all in Grimm's fairy tales as well for the German and French versions. But um, yeah, I love that book. Great illustrations and really really fun, like unique ideas that
Hmm.
are very very much the same in other cultures because all folk tales are same ideas. Um, anyways, why don't you tell us about the setting and the system for Vaesen, since that's what you're using, and then we can get into how your campaign is different after we talk about the system for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So the premise of Vaesen is creatures out of myth and folktale and legend are real. So far, nothing too kind of groundbreaking or shocking.
Hmm.
And the only people who can see and interact with them when they don't want to be seen are people with the second sight. So Vaesen takes place in the 1800s and is primarily set in Scandinavia, specifically Sweden. And so you have stories about creatures like trolls, like we were just talking about,
Right.
but also giants and ghosts and things that are not as common. Things like the night raven, things like the mealing, things like the neck that are very steeped in Scandinavian culture and folklore.
Hmm. Yep.
And your characters are going on various investigations, interacting with these supernatural creatures, and trying to settle conflicts and issues between humanity and the Vaesen. This game also typically takes place during the height of the Industrial Revolution.
Oh.
So human society is rapidly changing, it's growing, and the old ways that the Vaesen were often pacified are being forgotten. So
Ah.
your
Okay.
characters are caught in this kind of push pull between the world that's becoming and changing, the world that was and is very static, and both people and supernatural creatures who are torn in between.
Okay. That sounds a lot like some of the themes that we're playing in the Avatar series to me. That might be a weird touch point, but like the industrialization and like the spirit
Yeah.
world, and the
Hmm.
avatar is like the connection between the human world and the spirit world, and has to like help navigate those situations.
Yeah. I think there's definitely a lot of connection there and a lot of kind of that sort of mythic nature that kind of goes through a lot of the world of Avatar.
I was thinking from the Legend of Korra series because there wasn't as much
Hmm.
of that in the original series, but just because that's popular now, the Netflix series is coming out.
Hmm.
It's on my mind a little bit more. When I was reading about the setting, it also seemed very similar to like Supernatural or Buffy, sort of having like
Hmm.
the detective Scooby Gang kind of thing that's going around solving problems. Much more supernatural for that, but
Very much so. And Vaesen does really lend itself well to a mystery of the week kind of game.
mhm.
It's really easy to actually take a couple of tables from the back of the book and say, here's the creature that's going on in this mystery. Here's what's upsetting it. Here's the misdeed that's been committed in this community. And here's a secondary conflict, then rolling up some people, some places, and bada bing, bada boom, you've got a story you can jump right into.
All right. Yeah, that's always convenient when they provide those tools if someone
Mhm.
needs them. Also pads out the page count.
It definitely has a bit more in common with that Call of Cthulhu vibe, though. Characters also tend to be a little bit more fragile, both physically and mentally. So, unlike D&D, where you can really just kick in the door and go fight the giant by taking it out at the knees, that usually doesn't work too well in Vaesen.
Okay. So you have to like figure out how to exercise the ghost or something. You can't just go kick it in the nuts or something.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's all about kind of discovering clues, unraveling the mystery, figuring out why this creature is upset, and being able to help kind of put it at ease, or finding the creature's weaknesses so that you can drive it away.
Gotcha. Okay. Now because this is its own system that I'm imagine is
Hmm.
connected to Dragonbane and how the resolution mechanic works. Do you want to talk about a bit about that?
They're actually a little bit different.
Oh, okay.
So the Vaesen system is going to use the Year Zero engine by Free League that they use for a lot of their other games like Coriolis, Mutant Year Zero. I think Blade Runner uses Year Zero as well.
Yeah.
Dragonbane is using a modified version, actually, of the basic roleplay system that Chaosium created.
Oh, okay. Well, that's more of that Cthulhu stuff there.
Yep. So back in the day, they actually modified RuneQuest to make the original game that would become Dragonbane.
Mm-hmm.
And Free League kind of got the rights to remake it. But Vaesen is 100% their own unique thing that's using their Year Zero system. And that one is all about dice pools. So you have D6s that you'll roll. Because it's a horror game, it is actually a little bit hard to succeed on rolls. So you'll have a couple of D6s, generally between 1 to 10 at maximum. And the only thing that counts as a success is rolling a 6.
Ooh, that's rough.
Multiple 6s can be needed for some rolls, so you might need 2 or even 3 successes for a really challenging action.
Okay.
But the system does have something built in where you can choose to push your roll. So if you roll your 8 dice for something you should be really good at, and you completely bomb it, you can choose to push that and roll all 8 dice again, hopefully getting at least 1 success.
Gotcha.
But doing so gives you a condition, and you only have a limited number of those before your character becomes physically or mentally broken.
Okay, so that's the same kind of thing they used in Blades in the Dark. I'm remembering the push system there. Okay.
So kind of it's your rerolls and hit points all rolled into one.
Gotcha. Okay. And the dice pool system is, used in a ton of games. That's the only succeeding on a 6 is a really rough point there. Yeah.
And I think that's mostly for trying to go for that horror vibe. Where when you need to succeed, it's always a little bit chancy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it means you don't want to roll those dice if you can avoid it. Mm-hmm. So you might, run from a conflict instead of engaging in one because of how much the risk is.
Now my player's that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's fun. I think it encourages sort of acting more like a real person instead of
instead of a superhero.
Yeah, I mean, there's in D&D, your character can get knocked out and, they wake up 2 seconds later and they're fine and it doesn't matter. There's no long-term consequences in that game. Even death isn't a long-term consequence in D&D. So yeah, having much more risk is cool.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of, in Vaesen, you can actually wind up getting permanent negative conditions if you wind up becoming broken during a combat.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So things like a permanent limp or hallucinations or potentially even positives, although those are very risky to get.
Yeah, I was just reading through Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, and it has similar stuff where it has, if you get knocked out during a combat, then yeah, something very bad is happening to you. There's a 3 in 100 chance of something good. Something like that.
But it's just likely enough that it might happen.
Yeah.
There's at least that chance that you could always hope for.
And there's even you can take an advantage that's you get to roll twice when you get injured and choose the better results. It's okay, maybe I want to train like a Saiyan where they have to, from Dragon Ball, where getting beat up makes them stronger.
Just got to get right to the brink of death and then I'll definitely bounce back.
Yeah. How many limbs are you going to lose on the way? So that's the official setting for Vaesen is this Scandinavian stuff with trolls and gremlins and, well, maybe not gremlins, but
like ghosts and definitely a lot of trolls and giants and very kind of steeped in that Nordic culture.
Mm-hmm. Dark elves, maybe. I think those are a Nordic thing.
Interestingly, I don't think they have that in the book.
Okay, so it's more about the folklore instead of the Norse stuff. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, that is a separation there. Okay, but your campaign is set in Washington. like the state, right?
Yep. In the Seattle and Ballard area.
Mhm.
So what we did was take that kind of Nordic inspiration that a normal game of Vaesen has, and we moved it across the world. So I am a resident of Seattle. I've lived here actually as of right about now for the last decade. So it's about a 10-year anniversary of since I moved cross country out here.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just loved Seattle history.
I was assuming that you lived there if you were setting your campaign there.
Yep. And Seattle is a really interesting place where so much of the history is all of these like shady con men trying to make a buck.
Mm.
And so there are these kind of all these sort of tall tales of early Seattle. And I thought this could be really interesting to pull in and combine that with the other place that I lived, which was Ballard. Back in the early days, Ballard, which is now a Seattle neighborhood, was actually its own town and had a really strong Scandinavian presence. So I thought I could actually combine some of these core ideas from Vaesen while also pulling in some of that Seattle history and local folklore, and also some lumberjack tall tales, and start to kind of blend all of that together.
All right. Are you still setting it in like the Industrial Revolution time period?
But very late. So our game takes place in 1888 Seattle. In the standard Vaesen setting, the time period is just referred to as kind of a nebulous thing. It's not necessarily as clean cut or as an exact date or year.
Yeah, whatever you need, right?
Yeah. But we're setting it right at the turn of the century. So 1888 Seattle, the city is booming, Ballard is growing. There's a little tension between the two towns because Seattle is this very, very prosperous, growing community, and it's looking at Ballard because that's an area that it could expand into. So we get some kind of tensions that are built into the game, and we've also got a way of kind of tying in some of that Scandinavian folklore from the core book.
And is 1888 before or after Washington was a state?
Technically before, so it is the Washington Territory.
Oh, okay.
I would have to double check my years, but I believe Washington became a state in 1891.
Okay, so
But I'd have to double check it to be sure.
they'd be negotiating it at that point, probably.
Yep.
Or people would be buzzing about it at least.
Mm-hmm. And some people pushing for it, and some people kind of working against it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's another little tension you could bring in, I guess, if you wanted.
Mm-hmm.
The supernatural creatures, everyone, I'm assuming listening to this kind of knows a little bit about Seattle, so talking about like more in depth about the setting feels a little like, okay, well, go read a Wikipedia article. Or I guess, do you think it's worth talking about it more for like what it's like in that period?
A little bit.
Okay, why don't we talk about the physical part and then we can get into the supernatural part.
Perfect. So it's kind of interesting because when we think of Seattle today, it is the tech city.
Exactly.
And prior to being the tech city, it was the airplane city. One of Seattle's nicknames is Jet City, since we had Boeing right down the way.
Right.
And for years and years, it was a mechanical hub. But before that, it was a lumber town. So Seattle was known for basically the lumber industry.
Anyone that drives through Washington would.
Well, drives through Western Washington.
Okay.
When I came out here, I came from the eastern side of the state, and I was like, where are all the trees that I was promised out here? No one told me it was high plains and desert.
Well, I guess because you're still kind of in Montana, Idaho at that point, and they're...
Mm-hmm. The whole eastern half of the state is actually all desert. It's not until you get past the Cascade Mountains that suddenly you get into that classic, like, Washington state.
Yeah, that's the part of the state I've been in, so that makes sense.
So at the time, Seattle was very, very booming in the timber industry. And you had all of these logging camps going out. You had charcoal burners, and you had a major shipping industry as well. So it was a town that's pulling in all of these people from up and down the coast. There are stories of like Spanish treasure galleons off of nearby towns and settlements.
I feel like every port in America has a Spanish galleon off the coast that they talk about.
That's true, but we actually did have them. And
okay, it's true for Seattle. All right.
And we have the Graveyard of the Pacific nearby, so we have a lot of ghost ships.
Oh, that's right.
So it feels like an area that very much is this kind of frontier town on the edge of the wilderness that you could just disappear into the trees. And that felt very on brand for Vaesen.
Okay, yeah, no, I can see that. And the government for Seattle at that point, still a territory, so I guess they had a territorial governor, and that's appointed by the federal government, I think is the way that works. I'm forgetting.
That part I'd need to double check on. I've mostly been skipping over that level of it.
Okay, so it doesn't matter. All right.
Yeah, but we did have a mayor who was Henry Yesler, and was infamously crooked.
So this is a real person, right? Not a
real person. Yep.
Okay.
Real person. Henry Yesler was the owner of the single largest business in town.
Okay.
So he operated Yesler's sawmill, which in a lumber town, obviously the guy who owns the sawmill is the one who's doing pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And also made himself mayor, and shockingly kept finding reasons to give the sawmill tax breaks.
Wow.
He had a secretary who was his niece, who he paid an enormous salary to, and who never once set foot in Seattle, and also which he collected on her behalf. And so paid directly from the town treasury to this person who's never been here, and then pocketed for himself.
All right. That's classic industrial corruption, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all read stories about that in school.
Oh, yeah. So we've got folks like that, and kind of a lot of their stories have been shared in Seattle, where I feel like, especially back out east where I grew up, it gets a lot more polish put onto it. Kind of the founding fathers and people on the East Coast are like these sterling examples. And out here it was all like, oh no, he's shady as hell.
Yeah, I'm in Davis, so mine is like Sacramento history, and it's a lot of very, very similar kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a floodplain, but there was like a dry year, and there was a guy that noticed that and like sold a bunch of land to people, and then skipped town before the flood came. And those people got pissed off, but were too stubborn, so they built up the town. So
I will show you. We're gonna build here anyway.
Yeah, yep. So they built a big rampart to keep the river out, and they brought in a bunch of dirt, and now the old neighborhood of Sacramento is like 20 feet higher than the rest of the town because they basically built a hill to build the city on.
Mm-hmm. Seattle did something very similar. We were running out of room, so Henry Yesler, in his genius wisdom, said, well, I got a sawmill. I got sawdust I'm not doing anything with. Just pack that down on the mudflat and start building on that. So we have a whole neighborhood that is built on slowly decaying sawdust here.
I mean, yeah, in principle, that makes sense. Like, I get it.
It's just not going to be a good plan 100 to 200 years later.
Yeah. But who thinks that far ahead?
Nobody founding Seattle, that's for sure. You could tell by our street system.
Oh my god. That is something that is generally nicer about like American cities than European cities, is that street systems are like grids and make sense, whereas European cities are just like, well, you know, the milk route was easiest this way.
We couldn't build here. There was a castle wall.
Yeah, or there was a fire and we could have done a grid, but that would have been too easy for the peasants to organize. So we made it this confusing alleyway.
I feel like Seattle carried a lot of that same, let's say, European charm with it. There's a long-running joke here that we hired 5 city planners to organize the city, looked at all their designs and said, yes.
Oh my god. I mean, part of it's just like, building by the water or on a river. You just kind of have to like build with what's there, right? Okay, all right. Let's talk about the supernatural stuff. So I'm assuming you're not using trolls and giants. You're using like American stuff.
A little of each, actually.
Oh, okay.
So one of the things that I'm excited to play around with is because we're setting the game in Ballard, there's actually a really strong Norwegian population here.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Ballard has a long Norwegian history. Early Seattle, because it's so similar to the environment in Norway, attracted a ton of Scandinavian immigrants.
Okay.
So early Seattle was about 25% Scandinavian.
All right.
So part of the idea is a lot of the kind of supernatural creatures that were familiar in Scandinavia, when those folks started coming out here, began cropping up as well. And so the characters, not to get too far ahead of us, are going to be dealing with things like trolls, like various kinds of Vaesen that are typically found in that supernatural setting in Scandinavia. But also playing with some more distinctly American things.
Okay, so Vaesen like is not just a name for the system, but is also the name for like the creatures?
Yep. It's kind of a catch-all for anything supernatural in the game.
Okay.
So one of the other things that we're going to be playing around with, and my players haven't gotten to necessarily run into these just yet, is we're going to be pulling from a lot of what are called fearsome critter stories. Okay. Is this something you've ever heard of before?
No, I mean, it sounds familiar, but I'm not placing it.
Yeah. So these are basically American folktales that were created generally by lumberjacks about the creatures that they found out in the woods.
Okay.
So things like the Splinter Cat, which is basically like a giant mountain lion that runs into trees at top speed and causes them to explode.
Oh.
Or the Squonk, which is a creature so hideous it is always crying and leaving a river wherever it goes.
Okay.
And all of these are kind of these tall tales that these lumberjacks would tell out in the woods. Whenever they heard like a crash out in the forest, they're like, "Oh, that, yeah, oh, I know what that is," and try and like one up each other and do that kind of folk tale and tall tale telling.
Okay.
And so we're going to be pulling in a lot of that, as well as cautiously some other kind of local First Nation stuff. But that is something that I want to work with some sensitivity folks on to make sure that we're doing respectfully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking that the animal spirit stories was something that kind of fit for the American mythos.
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing Bigfoot?
You took the words out of my mouth. We're in Washington. We gotta do Bigfoot.
Yes.
Like, we gotta do Bigfoot. I don't know if my players are going to listen to this or not, but if they do, cover your ears. We are absolutely going to have a story with Bigfoot. I'm super excited for it.
All right.
That is going to be probably the penultimate story in the campaign. Like, I gotta do Bigfoot. I mean, I live in Washington. I gotta.
So I was thinking, going through like lists of other like stories that I know of that have some older folklore basis and some that are more modern ghost stories. Like, so the Vaesen, the mechanic, like the players have the second sight, so they can see the little fairy creatures, but other people can't.
Yep.
And I was thinking that like Freddy from the Friday the 13th movies kind of works that way. Like he's sort of invisible to a lot of people. Or the ghost thing in The Following, if you saw that one, or at least know of it.
It follows, right?
Yes, that's it. Sorry. Yeah,
Yep.
the following's a different one. Yes. Where, that's one that only the person that it is following can see it.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have like more murderous creatures like that that you're pulling from horror movies, or are you not doing that?
A little bit. I'm generally trying to keep the vibe in specifically folk horror, without getting too much into other veins of horror.
Okay,
Um,
so those two would
Still,
not fit
mhm.
because they're more sexual horror.
And generally more like kind of that 80s slasher horror for Freddy Krueger specifically.
Well, and
Uh,
his murders also had a sexual component because they always happen when people
oh
were
yeah,
sleeping and
yeah. Um, but that said, I am working on an adventure that is going to dip a little bit closer into the slasher genre.
Mhm.
So there will be a little bit of that. But generally trying to go for a little bit more of that like Midsommar vibe or like, oh my gosh, I'm suddenly blanking on the most famous folk horror movie, The Wicker Man.
Yep.
Uh, so really trying to hit kind of that type of vibe. There's a really great folk horror documentary, Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched.
Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, the Headless Horseman would be a great example of one that could be worked in.
Yeah, I mean that's more like localized to
Hmm
um, New England, but still do it, I guess.
Well, it's interesting because Vossen did actually have a supplement for Britain.
Okay.
And so they had kind of a spin off on British legend. And one of the creatures that they featured there is the Dullahan.
Okay.
So a headless horseman who notoriously rides throwing his head at people.
Yeah, I mean
Uh,
it's similar, but it's not the same
mhm.
story. But
Yeah,
yeah,
but definitely like you can kind of trace the antecedents of how they got from story A to story B.
right, right.
Uh, and so it makes it really easy, at least, to be able to pull the stats of, well, here's an example of how I could create a headless horseman
Mhm.
using that other book.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah, mechanically it would be pretty much the same.
Hmm
Maybe skip the armor and have it be easier to hit, I guess. I don't know how armor works in Vaesen, but
It's pretty simple. Generally, with all the Year Zero systems, they're going for kind of narrative complexity over mechanical complexity.
yeah.
So speaking of, we've had to do a lot of home brewing for it as well. Uh, so we've done a lot of tinkering with the system already from the ground up.
Yeah, I saw that in your notes and I wanted to get to it a little bit later. But yeah, I am interested in that part.
Absolutely.
Um the I wanted to talk about like a few other ideas I was having for like
Yeah.
I mean we already talked about Supernatural and Buffy, and that probably goes more into the Buffy at least more into the slasher vibe.
Mhm.
Supernatural, it seems like those stories are pretty much the ones that you're telling almost.
In a lot of ways, yeah. There's another show actually that was called Grimm that was, I think, a short-lived TV series that
Hmm.
actually featured creatures called Vaesen.
Oh,
But
okay.
was a little bit more like silly and goofy than the folk horror vibe we're going for.
Yeah. And another subset of American goblins and horror stuff that I was thinking of was H.P. Lovecraft.
Hmm
And there's a lot of spooky monsters there, and again, more on the like
hmm
New England area. But yeah, did you draw on any of that for inspiration, or does that too different?
So that is actually one that I really thought and debated on and decided to mostly steer away from.
Hmm.
Uh, Specifically because that gets into a branch of horror that's really focused on cosmic horror.
Right.
So, sort of the mind bending, otherworldly, alien functionality of these creatures who our poor mortal brains cannot comprehend and shatter under.
Right.
Uh, and it's interesting because Vossen has a similar mechanic where when you see some very scary creatures, you have to roll a fear save or potentially have a reaction where you become terrified. However, they aren't alien in the same way. They might think in an odd way, they might behave in an odd way. They may do things the characters can't understand necessarily, but they have reason behind why they're doing it. Whereas a kind of core part of that Lovecraftian horror is you can never understand. You will never be able to comprehend as a sane person why Cthulhu does what Cthulhu does. Mm-hmm. And even seeing it is enough to shatter your mind.
Right.
And that wasn't quite the vibe I wanted to go for with our horror story. I feel like in a lot of ways that folk horror gets back to a horror of simplicity. It's not about the mind-shattering awfulness of something, but about why people do things the way they do them, and how kind of past beliefs shape future actions, and how we sort of discover things in the shadows.
Okay. I guess one of my responses to that is I haven't done much horror myself. Like, I've done like horror stories within D&D, but it's still like, here's a monster, D&D. You're going to kill it with your sword. Like, it's not something where you need to do anything really special. There was only one case where that my players had to do something special for a horror monster. And that was mostly just because the CR was much higher than them, but they still kind of, you approach the challenge in the same way because that's the way the system works. So I guess what I'm thinking is, how does that approach change the experience for the players as opposed to for you as the DM? Because you sort of described your own feelings on it as a DM for the differences between Cthulhu, which is a horror game that a lot of people are at least like passively familiar with, and the Vaesen, like, sort of folk horror that you're describing.
From the player side, there is a lot of different things to engage with it. There's, in some ways, kind of that sense of nostalgia, which is a weird thing to say with horror. But
I get what you mean.
But with folk horror especially, getting some of those fairy stories, getting some of those grim stories like we were talking about at the beginning, and really being able to kind of dig into those and find kind of the creepy, unsettling parts of that, is sort of a weird nostalgia that I found players enjoy. That story of like Little Red Riding Hood, where you're like, oh, when I think about this gets really unsettling really quickly.
Yeah, that wolf is terrifying.
Yeah,
it's like scarier than a real wolf because it's like eating people whole and putting on human
clearly
clothing.
Thinking, yeah. And so some of it is that nostalgia, some of it is that exploration. The players in my game also really like to try and find a middle ground with the Vaesen. Wherever they can, they don't want to fight them. Both because the Vaesen are often fairly frightening to fight, and also because they want to find that peaceful resolution. They want to kind of step beyond a creature that scares them into what makes this thing tick. Can we find a way to help get things back to an equilibrium where they've been thrown out of whack? And so kind of that situation of horror going from a position of powerlessness into a powerful position.
Right.
Whereas D&D will often start in that powerful position and just keep going up.
Yep, exactly.
I have actually one really good horror encounter in D&D. And it borrowed from a YouTuber named Z Bradshaw, who had a whole piece on how to make zombies scary. Which was to basically make them go down in a single shot, super easy to take out, but there's a lot of them. And if one manages to bite you, they have an infectious bite.
Yeah, running that part of zombies.
Which D&D has not typically carried forward. And so I had an encounter where the players needed to sneak into this old campsite in an abandoned ruin, and it was crawling with these zombies, who have like froth coming out of their mouths and are shambling around and twitching. And they're all looking and kind of lurking in this jungle setting. And the players are carefully, cautiously making their way around, and they know if any of the zombies get alerted, they're all going to come for them. And the zombies outnumber them probably like 6-1. So it's not necessarily going to be a cakewalk or a wizard just throws a fireball. And they come around a corner and failed their perception checks and just stumbled across one zombie. And all of them immediately tried their most quiet attacks to take it out. And just due to the dice rolls, they all biffed it.
Oh.
And so this thing groans on its turn and comes shambling towards them. They're like, oh no. And I then explained to them a timer had started. And didn't explain what it meant. But just every certain number of rounds, as they're now fighting their way through, desperately trying to search through this camp to find the pieces of information they need, more and more zombies keep rolling in. And what at first was like, okay, yeah, we can knock these out. Bam, bam, bam. Oh no, there's 6 more. Oh no, there's 10 more. Oh, we're in over our heads on this. We gotta go. And ended with a zombie T-Rex in the distance, because could not.
Yeah, that sounds really well executed. I think they had an infectious zombie in 2nd edition.
Probably somewhere in there.
Yeah.
I know in 3rd edition they had zombies who could give you diseases, but none of them, I think, were like, turn you into a zombie in X number of days diseases.
Well, I mean, mummies did that.
Yeah.
Which feels weird to have mummies work that way. But yeah, mummies would turn you into a mummy with the mummy rot disease.
Mm-hmm.
And there were plenty that if they killed you, would like whites, if you died to a white, you turned into a white. If you died to a specter, you turned into a specter.
Things like that. Yep.
Yeah, shadow, you turn into a shadow. You died to an allop, you turn into an allop. So a lot of the undead had that like sort of self-generation thing on if they killed someone. But zombie horror usually has it be that if you are bitten and you survive, in the like more movie mythos instead of D&D stuff. So that makes it much more terrifying. If it was just like one bite and you're basically dead.
Yep. So what I did for them was they each got a Constitution save if they got bit. They did not know what the DC to pass was, and so were panicked every time. And I have never seen players so afraid to fight zombies after that.
That's nice. That's nice. Like we were talking about, like starting from a position of powerlessness and going to powerful. And my question was like, so the players have the second sight, right? So they can see all the goblins and fairies out there. Do they gain any additional power to influence that world besides what a normal person would have who can't see them?
They do not.
Okay.
So they are not spellcasters. They don't have magic relics. They might be able to find some of that through play, but by the book rules, they basically have kind of some talents and abilities, but they are just folks.
Yep. Just a police officer with a gun that he has to like fill out paperwork for the bullets so he doesn't want to shoot it.
Yep. Private investigators who are digging deeper than they should, occultists who've learned hidden secrets, disgraced military officers and vagabonds.
Getting all the Cthulhu stereotypes there.
Well, they've also got things like academics. They've got, I have not strayed from Call of Cthulhu stereotypes with academics.
No, I was thinking like lumberjack. I mean, if you're doing the Seattle like lumber stuff, or sawmill worker.
Yep. Lumberjack is actually a class that I homebrewed for our group. But cool. Sadly, no one has taken it yet.
Aw.
I keep hoping.
Well, yeah, let's get into your campaign. So you have like a podcast. So like there's, if people want the full skinny, they have it there, but let's get a summary.
Absolutely. So the premise of our game is the characters are supernatural investigators working for an organization out of Ballard that's a semi-secret society. called the Library in Defense of Mankind. Pardon me, I'm getting the name wrong on my own show. It is the
Library of Metaphysical Knowledge and Defense of Mankind.
That's the one. Thank you. It's a long enough name that even I forget it.
Yeah.
So much more commonly just called the library. There, they work for a group doing these various supernatural investigations, going out to help people who've come to the library to seek their assistance. So getting that kind of monster of the week vibe, we have a problem that comes in, someone believes something supernatural is occurring, and our characters go out to find out and get to the bottom of it. They won't necessarily know what kind of supernatural creature they're going to encounter, so they've got to dig in during the mystery and follow clues, investigate leads, talk to people, research the spaces where things are going weird to try and find out what's going on, and then figure out how they can actually stop that creature.
Okay. Yeah, seems like a lot of detective games work the same way. So yeah,
Yep.
I get the idea there, and having the base of operations makes sense. The library, in your survey, you said it was like a weird architecture.
Mm-hmm. The touchstone I would use for it is a place called the Winchester Mystery House.
Oh, okay. That's a good one. Yes.
So this sort of sprawling estate that's enormous, really built up, but makes absolutely no sense from an architectural standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
You have hallways that go off to nowhere. You have doors that just open onto dead ends. You have stairs that go up and go all the way around a hallway to just get to the room that's next door. The whole place is kind of this strange, odd place that's set off back in the woods and has this really eerie air about it. Mm-hmm. The locals in town in the game don't remember how long it's been there. And as far as any local knows, it's kind of just always been there, which is concerning for a town that's only about 50 years old. So we've got sort of strange, spooky air around this organization that the players are working for.
So the Winchester Mystery House was built that way because the old woman, Mrs. Winchester, thought she was being haunted by ghosts, and the confusing architecture was meant to confuse ghosts that would come into her house.
Yes. She is the heiress of the Winchester firearms money.
Exactly. Yep.
And believed that every person who'd been killed by a Winchester rifle, of which there were a lot, were coming after her.
Right.
And so she thought if she could always keep building and always keep the house growing, they could never get to her.
My memory from the tour is that the first floor of the house kind of makes sense because it was where like people were still coming for business, like, you know, people would come and drop off her groceries for her, so that she had to have like a normal place for them to drop off groceries and a kitchen for the servants to make her food in. And then once you get up into the second and third floor of the house, it's like absolutely
it gets
insane.
Weird. Yep.
I believe there is a door on the third floor that just
goes right out the side.
Yep, just opens out outside. There are sideways doors. There are windows that make no sense. There's passages that I think you can crawl through, but they don't let the guests do that.
They get smaller and smaller and smaller. So the library is not quite to that extent, but let's just say the vibe is similar.
Gotcha, yeah. And another sort of take I was getting from your written description of it, is that it had multiple entrances, like not in the sense of like, oh, there's a door over here on this side and a door over here on this side, but in the sense of there is a way to get into it in Seattle, and there is another way to get into it in like Miami.
Not quite that I've been establishing yet.
Okay.
So more in the vein of the layout is something that you try to make your way from point A to point B, but it can never be a straight shot.
Okay. Gotcha.
It's always got to be this looping, circuitous, I have to wander halfway around the house to get where I want to go.
Okay, so they based the housing plan off of Seattle's city grid.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Your players just haven't realized it yet.
Spoilers for the future.
Right, so the players are investigators that maybe have day jobs, but they come here to make sense of the weird things they're seeing.
Yep.
And who's in charge at the library?
The figure in charge is a gentleman named Matthias. Matthias Knudsen is a former priest who came over from Norway.
Okay.
He was a member of the Society, which is the kind of default group in the Vaesen core book in the Scandinavian setting.
Oh, okay.
But then broke off from them after a disaster happened, and most of them were wiped out. And he and a figure in the library who is the librarian named Old Agda came to America and eventually settled in the Ballard area.
Okay. So is this like a previous campaign you're talking about where they all got murdered, or?
Not at this time. I might do a one-shot to play through that at some point. But,
okay. That'd be cool.
The backstory in the Vaesen core book and why kind of your brand new investigators wind up inheriting a castle in kind of the normal Scandinavian setting is almost all of the society has been wiped out due to massacres by upsetting giants at one point, and also the strain that seeing these supernatural creatures takes on you. So dealing with these things that no one else can see tends to wear people down over time. And so the characters in the default game get handed a castle by someone who's locking themselves in an asylum, as they can no longer trust their own perceptions.
Gotcha.
So I didn't want to quite go with that exact same setup for an American game, and so built out a few more NPCs to help kind of flesh out the library, and have other characters who pop in and out who are other investigators.
Gotcha. All right. And are you doing a Monster of the Week kind of thing for it, or is there like a broader structure that you're applying to the campaign as a whole?
A little of both. So we have a narrative through line that is carrying over. But for the most part, each mystery is going to be self-contained. So each story will sort of be its own thing. It'll have some crossover on the edges, but generally won't have too much from a previous mystery. But we're also introducing certain threats at the end in a couple of interludes that are going to come back in a big way.
Okay. Why don't you walk us through like one of the adventures that you had?
Yeah. So the very first mystery that we have on the podcast, which is called Spirits and Monsters of Old Seattle.
Okay, that's the name of the podcast, Spirits and Monsters of Old Seattle? Okay, cool. Excellent.
The very first adventure we had, a character has come to the library because he believes he might be cursed. Terrible events have been happening around him, and he needs the assistance of the investigators to find out if he's haunted or if something supernatural is occurring. But just terrible accidents keep happening on the fishing ship he's on, and the other sailors are starting to look at him like he's awful luck. Mm-hmm. So the players go to investigate. One of them volunteers to be a sailor on the ship, and almost gets hit by a swinging boom on day one as a line breaks. As the characters are investigating, they realize there are two strange animals aboard the ship. A ship's cat, which allegedly has taken a person's finger off before, and an albatross perched in the crow's nest. They do some investigating, they go out to a bar and start talking to some old sailors, and they learn about a Nordic creature called a skepsra, or a ship spirit, and realize that having a skepsra aboard your ship is a source of incredible luck. Unless you have two of them. At which point they begin fighting and clashing. over who is the actual protector and guardian of the ship. And so they realize they've got these two spirits who are at war over the ship, and their poor guy is just getting blamed for it, but not actually responsible. He just happened to show up at the same time as one of these ship spirits came aboard.
There's this, saying you can never be too lucky, right?
Right up until you are.
Yeah, that sounds like what's happening here.
So they need to try and figure out a way to convince one of the ship spirits to leave so that the ship can go back to being the lucky ship that it was.
Okay.
And one of the mechanics that's baked into Vaesen is what's called a countdown to catastrophe. So it automatically has a system in place for escalating events. So I know if they were to just sit on their hands and do nothing and not participate, I would be annoyed because we're not doing a very interesting podcast.
Right.
But I've also got kind of a fail state for every adventure. So I've got a worst case scenario. Here's what goes down. And then I've got all the steps of it getting worse that can build up to that.
Okay.
So it gives it a really easy system to kind of escalate the tension at various points throughout the story.
Oh, and then if there's two things that they have to deal with at the same time, they have to make a choice. There's sort of what's gonna the consequences of those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Or if at any point they're going off on the wrong tangent, or they're digging into something, or if just kind of the tension has slowed down, suddenly I've got a lever that I can pull to say and then this happens.
Well, and I was going to say, the other thing you have there is you've got other investigators, right? So they could, potentially pawn something off onto someone else if they have a birthday party to get to or something. I don't know.
In theory. We haven't seen too much of that yet. And the way I've been kind of presenting it is a lot of these investigators are off on far-flung investigations.
Okay. So they can't.
So they don't usually have the cavalry that they can call in too often, but we might for some mysteries.
Okay. And you mentioned before that you'd made some alterations to the rules to make this work a little bit better. You want to talk about those a little bit?
Absolutely. So I'll be honest, I don't know if I can play a game and not start tinkering at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I have been doing this for so long that every single time I get it, I'm like, oh, great, this is fantastic. I'm going to start making changes. Just as soon as I open the book.
It's never quite what you want.
So Vaesen in particular is really geared towards approachability. It's super easy to get in, it's super easy to roll up a character, and it's super easy to get to the table and get playing.
I've often felt that systems that use a D6 as the primary resolution mechanic are trying to do that, because then people don't even have to buy dice. They can just go to their Monopoly game that everyone has in their house and raid the dice from that.
Exactly. But that said, while that is a great thing for especially stuff like convention gaming, for one-shots, for one-off games, it also tends to pair with a lack of mechanical complexity. And especially if you're doing something like a long-term campaign, those easy-to-play systems, you can accumulate so many experience points that suddenly you've got all the abilities.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the big things that I started tinkering with in Vaesen is things like different costs for abilities. So making the choices a little bit more mechanically interesting for the players on how they want to spend their experience points. In the default game, literally anything you buy just costs 5. And our characters, at the end of every mystery, were getting about 20 to 30 points.
Oh, wow.
So they were potentially getting 4 or 5 different new, kind of for D&D comparison feats. And that's going to get hard to track. It's going to be hard to remember all oh yeah, and I got this, and I think I got this, and oh yeah, I had that, I should have used that last round. So I started tinkering with a lot of the costs on things to make them a little bit more exciting, or a little bit more ooh, that's something I need to save up for. The fear mechanic that we alluded to earlier
Right.
also has a bit of a downside in the core way it's written.
Oh, what do you mean?
When a character makes a fear test, they roll a number of dice equal to one of their stats, either empathy or logic, and if they don't get any successes, they become terrified.
Okay.
A terrified character is going to faint, fight, freeze, or flee. And they're going to do that for 1d6 turns of combat. This means potentially if you choose something like, yeah, my character's real scared of this, he's going to run away, you might spend 6 rounds of the game running away. While Vaesen combat goes faster than something like D&D, 6 rounds basically still means you're out of the fight entirely.
Yep.
So I cut that down to a D3 rounds to try and make it just a little bit more manageable for the group, and so it wouldn't necessarily like take someone out of play.
Yeah, that's it makes them a little bit stronger, but also makes the game more fun.
Yeah, and especially for a podcast, having the players actually get to participate is sort of important. Rather than, I spent another turn running away.
Yeah, I had that in one of my D&D sessions where there's this player that hadn't shown up for a while. He showed up, his character got knocked unconscious on like the first 2 or 3 rounds of the combat, and he was playing the healer, so no one else could heal him.
Yep.
So he hadn't shown up for a while, and then he played for an hour, and then his character was knocked out for the rest of the session. I was like, oh, this doesn't feel good for you, does it?
Thanks for showing up.
Yeah. It's
Yep.
like, I want. Oh, yeah, it's so good to see you again, and then just sit here and do nothing for a few hours. Thanks, buddy.
So yeah, adding a lot of house rules to try and minimize those points of not participating.
Mm-hmm.
And again, because Vaesen is a pretty simple, straightforward system, I also saw a lot of opportunities for adding stuff. So I actually have put out 3 supplements that are pay what you want on DriveThruRPG.
Cool.
That add new equipment, add new talents, add new options. I have one on adding a complete new subsystem for drugs and addiction.
Oh, okay.
So kind of the classic, if you're going to have an 1800s investigator, you're probably going to consume laudanum at some point.
Yep.
You might want some cocaine. How does that work? It's not in the rules. So I added a Victorian medicine supplement.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that existed in Norway and Sweden at the time.
A shocking amount. And I can tell you a lot of it definitely existed in Seattle.
Yeah, and the Victorian setting you were talking about in England, yeah, definitely there too. So,
but they had definitely things like laudanum and other recreational products in Scandinavia as well.
Yeah, opium was all over the world in the late 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, cocaine as well.
And cocoa wine, as I discovered researching that product.
Was that before absinthe became illegal, even though it doesn't actually do anything?
Yes. So I forget when cocaine wine was taken off of the shelves, but that was a direct predecessor to Coca-Cola.
Yes, that's right. Forgot Coca-Cola also had cocaine in it once upon a time. Absinthe was made illegal in 1915. I just looked it up.
Okay, so yeah, significantly before.
Yeah, so you could play into the folklore of absinthe, I guess. Maybe there's like a monster that makes people go crazy when they drink it.
I got great news. Absinthe is in that supplement.
Ooh, all right. You already thought of it. Perfect.
So I tried to go with a lot of the classics.
Yes.
So we've also got things like new special abilities for characters, new pieces of equipment, things like fencing foils, and things like shotguns that are kind of that classic equipment that you see monster hunters and investigators bring out.
Mm-hmm. So earlier you said that the game was more like narrative focused when we were talking about like the Headless Horseman versus Doulahan and how they're basically the same monster. How much does that matter for the equipment? Like, is a shotgun really that different than a pistol for how it interacts in the game?
In the core book, no. The core book actually doesn't even have shotgun as an option.
Okay.
It has rifles and pistols, and the rifle has a longer range and hits harder. And that is where their differences ended.
Okay.
But I felt like there was room to make things a little bit more mechanically interesting there. And so start to kind of do some of that exploration and kind of build on things that you tend to find in campaigns. So I created a shotgun that actually has a penalty to hit, but can hit multiple targets who are in the same area.
Okay.
And other kind of interesting little items, like, for instance, a pressurized air rifle, which at one point the Prussian army was attempting to use as their standard military arm.
A BB gun,
So,
really?
that is what they were using in place of gunpowder weapons.
Okay, all right. I mean, you always have access to the propellant, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, they had basically these pressurized air tanks that they would carry with them and fit onto the gun and then shoot out a bullet at high speed. They were also completely silent, which is an advantage compared to a gunpowder rifle.
Yeah, BBs don't make sound until they hit something. That's a good point.
So there is a Sherlock Holmes story where he tries to figure out how a silent shot was fired because it came from his pressurized air rifle. And it was an actual thing that was used in a whole, country's military at one point.
Wow, okay. I had no idea it was used at a military scale.
Well, let's just say there's a reason that we are not still seeing them used today.
Yes, the Prussian cavalry was famously defeated in World War II, I think.
Yeah, and I think even by then they'd already abandoned it.
Yeah, maybe World War I, I forget. But yeah, it was like, why are you still using horses, buddy? In Vaesen, everyone's playing like humans, right? Is there a way to play one of the little spooky creatures?
Yes and no. You could play, for instance, a character who is a changeling. So was taken as a baby and raised amongst the Vaesen, and then made their way back to humanity.
I mean, isn't that the opposite of a changeling?
Yes and no. The changeling would be the creature who is left behind.
Right.
But generally they want to take a human and raise them amongst themselves. And one of the kind of core identities they have for one of the occultist classes as kind of a background is you were taken as a child and got away and came back to find someone living your life.
Right. So this was in the Trolls book that I read as a kid. I remember the story where like trolls, the babies that trolls have are awful and they scream all the time. So they hate them. So they always want to swap their nasty little troll baby with a human baby. It was a story. It's like a story that's used to explain colic in kids, where they just scream all the time because they have tummy problems. Yep. They don't know how to fart. And the kid that's screaming all the time is actually like a troll baby that was swapped. So I love that little story. I thought it was really cool.
So that's generally as much as Vaesen by default gets into sort of playing as a supernatural being. But there are certain things that can develop through the course of play. You can make deals with supernatural creatures, you can make bargains, you can acquire supernatural items. But those are all things that you have to kind of find through the story.
Okay. You could maybe get your foot cut off and replace it with a goat foot.
Potentially.
Okay. Good. I always wanted to have a character that had that happen to them. And one of the other usual questions I ask people is about the gods of their campaign world. And I mean, within the context here, like we already know what the religions are within a real world setting. But I guess following from that, if you have like all these ghosts and goblins everywhere, do you also have, like if you present the cross, does that do anything? Is there actually like power to religious observances?
For a lot of the Vaesen, yes. We actually talked about trolls as an example. A character can't enter a troll's home if they have a crucifix on their person.
Oh, so the other way around. Okay.
So, for instance, basically, you are so anathema to a troll that if you've got a cross in your pocket and you tried to go in the doorway, you just couldn't do it. It'd be like walking into a brick wall. But this is where some of that kind of folklore and that mythology start to play in. So if the characters were to pass a check, they might know, well, I can walk in if I turn my coat inside out and walk backwards, because then I trick the troll's lair into thinking I'm leaving.
Oh my god.
And this is all in the book, and it's all in the folklore. And so one of the ways to drive a troll out would be to nail a crucifix into their hearth. They could not live there anymore, and they would have to leave.
Okay. Well, you got to sneak the crucifix in there. Okay.
Exactly. And so that could then kind of form the crux of the mystery, as you were trying to say, all right, we've got this troll, it's a menace, it's wrecking everything. Maybe we need to force it to leave the area. How do we get into its lair to get this here to make it leave? And then starting to explore why is it suddenly a menace?
This is reminding me of some speed running in video games strategies. It sounds entirely weird, but there are things in old games where they programmed it a certain way because they were limited on like hard drive space for how big they can make the game, that you can kind of trick the game. And one of the ways is exactly that. If you walk backwards through a doorway that normally you can't walk through it forwards, you will be able to do it. It's just like we've wrapped around and the same thing is happening, but just sort of accidentally for like our modern entertainment.
I mean, it makes me think also of like those old kind of fairy stories of like, oh, you can tell who the strange fairies are because they've got 6 fingers on their hands and their faces never quite look right. And that's just AI art.
That's funny.
No, everything old is new again.
Yeah. The initial question of does religion have power? And then the answer is yes. Does it have to be a crucifix? Could you do the same thing with like a Star of David or?
Yeah. That's something that I'm going to let my players kind of discover as they play through.
Okay.
For right now, they have an NPC ally who is a priest. And so kind of a little bit of a generic Christian denomination type of priest.
Okay.
But they also have a lot of resources and texts that point towards the Old Norse things. So looking into Old Norse beliefs and referencing back to some rituals they might be able to do using those.
Okay.
So playing again with some of that new culture versus old culture.
One of the other things I was thinking of for this is you're using Vaesen, which is based off of the BRP system for
Year Zero.
Right, indirectly based off of the BRP system, I should say. There's a granddad relationship there, I suppose. And I was thinking of like the more modern detective Gumshoe system. Is that something you ever considered for this, the stories you wanted to tell here, or did that just not quite fit for you?
I had not. I actually started with Vaesen and thought of doing the campaign because I liked the system so much.
Okay.
So I had not started with the story and then kind of figured out what system to use. The Vaesen system had really pulled me in, and I said, what story do I want to tell using these rules? Which I will then immediately tinker with.
All right. Yeah. Then, yeah, if that's your call to it, then yeah, it definitely makes more sense. Then, the Gumshoe rules are admittedly a bit darker. I think like there's one for vampires, there's one for Cthulhu.
Does Night's Black Agents use Gumshoe, or is that a different system?
Yeah, that's the vampire one.
Okay.
But they all have some supernatural component. But if it's not a supernatural component that fits with what you're trying to do with it, then there's a lot of tinkering you'd have to do to make it work, and it wouldn't be worth it compared to just using the the system that you found that has the setting that you want,
Mm-hmm.
or at least half of the setting that you want because you moved it to where you live.
That feels pretty accurate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we've hit all the major points that I wanted to get on. Was there anything else that you wanted to add on or share?
Trying to think. Mostly just that this is an absolutely gorgeous book. If folks haven't checked it out yet, you should absolutely look at the art for Vaesen. It is all done by an artist from Sweden named Johan Egerkrans, and it has kind of an interesting origin point to it, in that he published a book on Swedish mythology and folklore, and basically made it almost like a D&D monster manual of Swedish folklore and creatures, because he grew up with D&D monster manuals. And then it came all the way full cycle with Free League, who reached out to him about making a game from his book that was inspired by role-playing games.
Yeah, kind of like the Game of Thrones TV show, where George Martin was originally a TV show writer, but he was tired of writing episodes for other people, so to tell his own story, he went off and wrote Game of Thrones, and then ended up being able to turn it into a TV show.
Then turned it into his own TV show.
Right, right. That's what he'd wanted to do all along.
Yeah. Vaesen is just such a cool system. It's so flexible and easy to jump into. You could set it on the other side of the world, and it's still very easy just to immediately jump right into it. So, if folks haven't, definitely check it out. And if you like it, maybe give Spirits and Monsters of Old Seattle a listen.
Well, I guess obvious question for the book itself, is it in English or Norwegian?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
So the art book that Johan Egerkrans did is both in English and in Swedish, and the Vaesen rules are in English and Swedish as well.
Okay.
So you can get either one, whichever one you want.
Okay, cool. And the question I usually end on is, do you have any advice for other DMs?
Don't be afraid to tinker with things. Just feel free to start poking at stuff, changing things, and seeing what works. As long as you and the players are on the same page about trying it, then the worst that happens is you say, oops, that did not work like how I expected, and you roll it back and you try it another session. I've known a lot of DMs and a lot of players who have said, like, well, we got to play it this way. It's how the rules work. We don't like it, but we have to. It's in the book. Mm-hmm. But as soon as it's your game, start playing it the way that seems fun to you. And if that means basically breaking the whole thing apart and then completely reworking it, you absolutely should.
Yes, that was one that I've often felt for modern, the sort of modern explosion of D&D, where people have this conception of having the like mechanical rules be like irrevocably tied to the non-mechanical rules.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was a question on Reddit recently about what happens to a paladin when his oath of vengeance is fulfilled and he's killed the person he has the oath against. And my thought was like, what are you talking about? Nothing. Like, his mechanical abilities have nothing to do with that. Like, you could have an oath of vengeance paladin that is just like describes himself entirely different. It doesn't matter.
Oh, I mean, I think the simple answer is, what do you want to have happen?
Yeah, and obviously that.
Like, maybe the character retires and is like, I'm done, I have fulfilled my quest. Or it's like, oh, you know what? Actually, I gotta go take out this character's boss. I have only begun working my way up the chain.
Yeah, I think it was the idea that they had done the boss as well.
But yeah, I would say always, as long as the players and the DM are in sync on things, feel free to start pulling stuff apart, changing things. And also, I'm obviously a little biased since I'm running a lot of systems that are not D&D. But try some things outside of Wizards of the Coast. Poke around at things from Free League, things from Chaosium, things from Onyx Path Publishing. There are a lot of indie publishers out there, so check out a game you never played before.
Yeah, there's so many. Kobold, Osprey, Sanguine, I mean, Blades and Powered by the Apocalypse get a lot of attention.
Mm-hmm. So there's so many things that, especially if you want to run something that is not kick in the door heroic fantasy, you got a lot of options. So definitely a lot of things out there to explore.
And like you said, the rules, like, sort of, you have to read a new rule book, but they actually are easier to understand.
Mm-hmm. And especially after you've gotten familiar with one or two, jumping into the third system is like, yeah, I see how this works. And you can then again start tinkering with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Bryon. This is great having you on the show.
Yeah, it's been fantastic chatting with you.
Quick reminder that I'm looking for people to go on the show, so if you or someone you know would be interested, please direct yourself or them to gocorral.com/SDS. That's GOCORRAL.com/SDS.